That girl who threw coins at me in high school hallways, calling me poor and pathetic, was now on her knees in my emergency room 15 years later, begging me to save her child. When I saw the fear in her eyes, I smiled, because this opportunity fate had handed me was far more than a simple medical procedure. The syringe in my hand held not just medicine, but the heavy weight of the past. When you hear about the miracle that happened in that room that night, and what I did in the end, you won't believe how sharp the sword of justice can be. Before we move on to the rest of the story and that breathtaking ending, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what justice means to you. If you're ready, let's go back to that night. My name is Madison Hayes. I am the most senior emergency room nurse at Detroit Mercy Hospital. People usually call me the Iron Lady, because even during 36-hour shifts, my hands don't shake and my voice never rises, even in the most chaotic moments. This uniform I wear, the stethoscope around my neck, and the dozens of staff under my command are my victory. But I have to be honest, the road I took to reach this power was hell itself. Before I became this strong woman everyone respects today, I was just the poor scholarship girl. My stomach still cramps when I remember those cold corridors of nursing school. And there was only one reason for all those cramps: Brittany Collins. Brittany. The richest, most spoiled, and cruelest girl in school. She would make fun of my lunch money, point at my old clothes in the middle of class, and laugh. "You don't belong here, Madison," she would say. "You're only good for cleaning up after people like us." Back then, I would bow my head, grit my teeth, and just focus on my studies. I had no answer for her because I had no power. But life hands the biggest trump card to those who wait, at the most unexpected moment. Exactly 15 years have passed. That humiliated girl is gone, replaced by a professional managing Detroit's toughest cases. Last night, the ER was like a battlefield. Siren sounds, stretcher squeaks, and radio announcements were all mixed together. Just as I was about to take a sip of my coffee and catch my breath, the automatic doors slid open with a loud noise. The cold air rushing in, and that scream silenced the entire department in an instant. "Help! Is anyone there? My son can't breathe. Please!" A woman in an expensive fur coat with ruined makeup and hands trembling with panic rushed in, clutching an 8-year-old child. The boy was turning blue, clutching his throat and wheezing. Anaphylactic shock. The situation was critical. We had seconds. I yelled to my team, "Get a gurney!" and ran toward the woman. As we took the child from her arms and laid him on the stretcher, I looked at the mother's face, and in that moment, the world stopped. Standing before me, aged but with that arrogance still ingrained in her features, was that woman, Brittany Collins. She didn't recognize me at first. Her eyes were fixed only on her dying son, Ethan. "He has an allergy. He ate peanuts. We didn't know. Please do something," she screamed. As I coolly checked the child's airway, I adjusted my ID badge out of the corner of my eye. That piece of metal with my name on it glinted in the light. Head nurse Madison Hayes. Brittany's eyes locked onto the badge. First a wave of shock, then shame, and finally an expression of pure terror spread across her face. She remembered me. She remembered the days she treated me like trash, the tears she made me shed. She remembered it all. Her son's life was between the two lips of the woman she had told years ago, "You're only good for cleaning up after people like us." She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my flesh, her voice trembling, stripped of all that old arrogance. She whispered, "Madison, my God, it's you. Please. Whatever happened in the past, I beg you, don't punish my son. Save him." I looked down at her with that unshakable authority 15 years had given me. I held the adrenaline syringe up in the air. This needle would bring Ethan back to life. But for Brittany, the real lesson was just beginning. "Step back, Brittany," I said, my voice ice cold. "You are in my territory now, and I make the rules." The security guard took Brittany by the arm and led her to the waiting area as she screamed and cried. but I had already turned my back on her because Ethan's oxygen saturation had dropped to 72%, and we were losing him fast. I inserted the adrenaline needle into his thigh with a swift motion and started the IV line, while my team surrounded the boy like a well-oiled machine. Jenny, my most experienced assistant, was monitoring his vitals while Derek prepared the oxygen mask, and I checked his airway one more time to make sure there was no obstruction that would prevent him from breathing. The child's lips were purple, and his little chest was heaving with the effort to pull in air, but nothing was working because his throat had swollen shut from the allergic reaction. I had seen this 1,000 times before, but something about this case was different, and it wasn't just because his mother was Brittany Collins. No, it was because as I looked down at this innocent child struggling for his life, I saw myself 15 years ago, struggling and gasping for air in a different way, drowning in humiliation and poverty, while Brittany stood over me laughing. But I pushed those thoughts aside because I am a professional, and this child had done nothing wrong. Get me the epinephrine infusion and prepare for intubation if he doesn't respond in 2 minutes, I ordered, my voice steady and clear. The team moved like clockwork, and I felt that familiar surge of power that came from being in complete control of a life-or-death situation. This was my domain, my kingdom, and everyone here answered to me. Brittany's screams echoed from the waiting room down the hallway, and I could hear her begging the security guard to let her see what was happening, but I had given strict orders that no family members were allowed in the trauma bay during critical procedures. It was hospital policy, but I would be lying if I said I didn't take a certain satisfaction in knowing she was out there, powerless and terrified, just as I had been powerless and terrified all those years ago when she made my life a living hell. 2 minutes passed, and Ethan's color started to improve slightly as the adrenaline began to work its magic, opening up his airways and allowing oxygen to flow into his starving lungs. His saturation climbed to 80%, then 85, then 90, and I could see the panic in his eyes starting to fade as he realized he could breathe again. "That's it, sweetheart," I said softly, brushing his hair back from his sweaty forehead. "You're going to be okay. Just keep breathing for me." The crisis had passed, but we weren't out of the woods yet because anaphylactic shock can have a second wave, a rebound effect that can be even more dangerous than the first attack, so I ordered the team to move him to the intensive care unit where he could be monitored closely for the next 24 hours. As we wheeled him out of the trauma bay, I finally allowed Brittany to approach, and the look on her face when she saw her son alive and breathing was something I will never forget. She fell to her knees right there in the hallway, sobbing uncontrollably, reaching out to touch Ethan's hand as we passed by. "Thank you," she gasped, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Madison. Thank you so much." But I didn't respond because I wasn't ready to forgive her yet, and honestly, I didn't know if I ever would be. I simply nodded to the orderlies to keep moving and walked alongside the gurney, my hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. Once we had him settled in the ICU with all the monitors beeping steadily and the nurses taking over his care, I finally stepped out into the hallway and leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. My hands were shaking now, not from the medical emergency, but from the emotional weight of seeing Brittany again after all these years. I had imagined this moment so many times, had fantasized about what I would say to her if I ever got the chance, but now that it had actually happened, I felt strangely empty. Dr. Peterson, the attending physician on duty that night, came up to me with a cup of coffee and a concerned look on his face. "That was incredible work in there, Madison," he said, handing me the cup. "That kid owes you his life." I took a sip of the bitter coffee and stared at the ICU doors where Ethan lay recovering. "I was just doing my job," I replied, but we both knew it was more complicated than that. "The mother wants to speak with you," he continued, glancing down the hallway. "She's been asking for you specifically. Says you two know each other from way back." I felt my jaw tighten because I knew this conversation was coming, but I still wasn't prepared for it. "Tell her I'll be there in a few minutes," I said, needing time to compose myself and decide exactly how I wanted to handle this situation. Peterson nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the ghosts of the past that suddenly seemed so present in these sterile hospital corridors. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who ate lunch alone in the bathroom stall because Brittany had convinced everyone in school that I was beneath them, that I smelled like poverty and desperation. I thought about the time she dumped her cafeteria tray on my books and laughed while I tried to save my notes from the spilled juice and mashed potatoes. I thought about the scholarship ceremony where she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear that charity cases like me were why the school's reputation was declining. But I also thought about who I had become in spite of all that cruelty, or perhaps because of it. Every insult had been fuel for my ambition. Every humiliation had hardened my resolve to prove her wrong, to rise above the station she had tried to keep me in. And now here I was, literally holding the power of life and death over the person she loved most in the world. And the irony was so thick I could taste it like copper on my tongue. I finished my coffee, threw the cup in the trash, and walked slowly toward the family waiting area where Brittany sat hunched over in a plastic chair, her expensive coat draped over her shoulders and her mascara creating dark rivers down her cheeks. When she saw me approaching, she jumped to her feet so fast the coat fell to the floor, and I could see her hands trembling as she clasped them together in a gesture that looked almost like prayer. "Madison," she began, her voice hoarse from crying. "I don't even know where to start. I know what I did to you back in school was unforgivable. I was a horrible person, cruel and shallow, and you didn't deserve any of it." She paused, swallowing hard, and I could see it was taking every ounce of courage she had to face me like this. "But please, I'm begging you, don't let my past mistakes affect how you treat my son. He's innocent. He's everything to me." I stood there looking at her, really looking at her for the first time since she had burst through those emergency room doors, and I noticed things I hadn't seen in the chaos of the medical emergency. She had aged, of course, but it was more than that. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and stress. Her hands bore signs of work rather than the pampered manicure she used to flaunt. And her clothes, while expensive, weren't the cutting-edge designer pieces she used to wear like armor. Life had humbled her somehow, and I found myself curious about what had happened in the 15 years since we last saw each other. "Your son is going to be fine," I said, keeping my voice professional and detached. "We've stabilized him and he's under observation in the ICU. Barring any complications, he should make a full recovery." Relief washed over her face so completely that she actually staggered and had to grab the back of the chair to steady herself. "Oh, thank God," she whispered. "Thank God. I don't know what I would do if I lost him." "You'll need to speak with the doctor about his allergy management going forward," I continued, as if I were giving discharge instructions to any other patient's family member. "He'll need to carry an EpiPen at all times, wear a medical alert bracelet, and you'll have to be extremely careful about checking food labels for peanut contamination." She nodded frantically, hanging on my every word like they were gospel, and I realized with a start that she was looking at me with something close to awe. "I had no idea you became a nurse," she said softly, almost to herself. "I mean, I knew you were studying for it back then, but I never imagined you'd be running an emergency room. You're incredible, Madison. You always were, even when I was too stupid and cruel to see it." Her words caught me off guard because they sounded genuine, not like the calculated manipulation I had expected, and I felt the first crack in the wall of ice I had built around my heart when I saw her walk through those doors. But I wasn't ready to let her off the hook that easily because words were cheap, and I had carried the weight of her cruelty for 15 years, through countless nights of self-doubt and tears, through moments when I almost gave up on my dreams because her voice in my head told me I wasn't good enough. "Save your gratitude," I said coldly. "I didn't save your son for you. I saved him because that's what I do. It's my job to save lives, regardless of who the patient is or who their parents are. The words hit her like a physical blow, and I saw her flinch, but she didn't look away and she didn't make excuses. "You're right," she said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. In fact, I owe you an apology that's 15 years overdue and probably worthless at this point, but I'm going to give it to you anyway." She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady, despite the tears still flowing down her face. "I was a monster to you, Madison. There's no other word for it. I made your life hell because I could, because it made me feel powerful and important, and because I was too insecure about myself to see what I was doing to another human being. Every night for the past 15 years, I've thought about the things I said to you, the way I treated you, and I've wished I could go back and change it. But I can't. All I can do is tell you how deeply sorry I am and hope that somehow, someday, you might find it in your heart to forgive me." I wanted to laugh in her face, to throw her apology back at her and tell her it meant nothing after all this time, but something in her eyes stopped me. There was a brokenness there, a genuine remorse that I hadn't expected to find, and it made me pause and reconsider whether holding on to my anger was really serving me anymore. "Why?" I asked, the question I had wanted to ask for 15 years finally escaping my lips. "Why did you treat me that way? What did I ever do to you?" Brittany looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around and around on her finger. "Nothing," she admitted. "You did absolutely nothing to me. That's what makes it so much worse." She lifted her eyes to meet mine, and I saw shame and regret swimming in their depths. "The truth is, I envied you. You were smart, hardworking, genuinely kind to people, and you were there on merit while I was only there because my parents could afford the tuition. Deep down, I knew you were better than me in every way that mattered, and instead of trying to be a better person, I tried to destroy you so I wouldn't have to face my own inadequacy." Her confession stunned me into silence because it was the last thing I had expected to hear. All these years, I had assumed she tormented me simply because she was cruel, because she enjoyed having power over someone weaker. But this explanation was somehow more painful because it meant I had been right all along. I was worthy. I did belong. And she had known it even while she was trying to convince me otherwise. "You almost succeeded," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There were days I wanted to quit, to give up and go back to being invisible because maybe that would hurt less than being your target. But you didn't quit," Brittany said, and there was something like pride in her voice. "You kept going. You finished school, and look at you now. You're exactly what I was afraid you'd become, someone who proved that money and status don't mean anything compared to skill and determination. You won, Madison. You beat me in every way that counts." She reached out as if to touch my arm, but thought better of it and let her hand drop. "And I'm glad you did, even though it means I have to face what I did to you." Before I could respond, my pager went off with an urgent alert from the ICU, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach because urgent pages about patients who had just been stabilized were never good news. "I have to go," I said abruptly, already turning toward the ICU, and I heard Brittany gasp behind me as she realized what an urgent page might mean for her son. We both ran down the hallway, her expensive heels clicking against the linoleum, and my nursing shoes squeaking with each step, and I could hear her praying under her breath, pleading with God to spare her child. When we burst through the ICU doors, I saw a flurry of activity around Ethan's bed, and my worst fears were confirmed because he was having a biphasic reaction, the dreaded second wave of anaphylaxis that sometimes occurs hours after the initial attack. His oxygen saturation was plummeting again, and his little body was convulsing as his immune system went into overdrive, attacking itself in its confused attempt to fight off the perceived threat of the peanut protein. "Hold her back," I ordered the security guard as Brittany tried to rush to her son's bedside, because the last thing we needed was a hysterical mother getting in the way of the medical team trying to save his life. She fought against the guards' restraining arms, screaming Ethan's name over and over, but I blocked her out and focused entirely on the child who was dying right in front of me for the second time that night. This time was different, though, because his body had already been through so much trauma, and the medications weren't working as quickly as they should have been. I barked orders at my team, demanding more epinephrine, preparing the intubation equipment, running through every protocol we had for severe anaphylaxis, but nothing was bringing him back from the edge. His heart rate was becoming erratic on the monitor, the beeping growing irregular and frightening, and I knew we were running out of time and options. Dr. Peterson was working alongside me now, his face grim as he tried to establish a second IV line while I manually bagged oxygen into Ethan's lungs, forcing air past the swelling that was trying to suffocate him. "He's not responding," Peterson said, stating the obvious thing we both knew and feared. "Madison, we might lose him." Those words echoed in my head like a death sentence, and behind me I could hear Brittany's anguished sobs as she realized her son was slipping away. In that moment, something shifted inside me, a clarity I hadn't experienced before, and I suddenly understood that this wasn't about revenge or justice or evening the score with someone who had wronged me. This was about an innocent child who deserved to live, who deserved to grow up and have a future, regardless of the sins of his mother. Every cruel thing Brittany had done to me seemed to fade into insignificance compared to the life hanging in the balance on that hospital bed, and I made a decision that would change everything. "Get me the experimental protocol from Dr. Chen's research," I said firmly, referring to a new treatment approach for refractory anaphylaxis that hadn't been officially approved yet but had shown promising results in clinical trials. Peterson's eyes widened because using an experimental protocol without proper authorization could cost me my career, my license, everything I had worked so hard to build. "Madison, you can't," he said. "If this goes wrong, you'll be held responsible. They'll destroy you." I looked down at Ethan's face, at his closed eyes and blue lips, at the way his chest barely rose despite the oxygen we were forcing into him, and I thought about all the times I had felt powerless in my life, all the moments when I wished someone with power had chosen to help me instead of hurt me. "I don't care," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "Get me the protocol now, that's an order." Peterson hesitated for only a second before nodding and running to the medication room, and I turned to look at Brittany through the glass partition. She was on her knees on the floor, her hands pressed against the glass like she was trying to touch her son through the barrier, and when our eyes met, I saw in her face every parent's worst nightmare playing out in real time. She wasn't the popular girl who had tormented me anymore. She wasn't my enemy or my bully. She was just a mother watching her child die and knowing there was nothing she could do to stop it. And in that moment, I forgave her. Not because she deserved it or because her apology had been adequate, but because holding on to hatred while a child's life hung in the balance felt like a betrayal of everything I had become. Peterson returned with the medication, a bright blue vial that contained a synthetic compound designed to rapidly reverse severe allergic reactions by blocking multiple inflammatory pathways simultaneously. "This is it," he said, handing it to me with hands that trembled slightly. "But Madison, you need to know that if this doesn't work or if it causes complications, the hospital board will crucify you. You'll lose everything." I took the vial and drew up the correct dosage, my hand steady despite the enormity of what I was about to do, and I looked at the amber liquid in the syringe like it was liquid hope. "Then I lose everything," I said simply, and I injected the experimental compound into Ethan's IV line, while everyone in the room held their breath and watched the monitors with desperate intensity. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, and I began to think I had made a terrible mistake that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But then, like a miracle unfolding before our eyes, Ethan's oxygen saturation began to climb, slowly at first, and then more rapidly, and his heart rate started to stabilize into a normal rhythm. The swelling in his throat began to recede visibly. His color started to return from that deathly blue to a healthier pink. And most incredibly, his eyes fluttered open, and he took a deep, shuddering breath on his own without the assistance of the oxygen bag. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice hoarse but unmistakably alive, and the entire ICU erupted in controlled celebration as the nursing staff realized we had just witnessed something extraordinary. I stepped back from the bed, my legs suddenly weak, and leaned against the wall while Peterson took over monitoring Ethan's continued recovery. Through the glass partition, I could see Brittany's face transformed by joy and relief. And when the security guard finally let her enter the room, she ran to her son's bedside and gathered him into her arms, careful not to disturb the IV lines and monitors, sobbing his name over and over like a prayer of thanksgiving. After several minutes of ensuring Ethan was truly stable and responding well to the experimental treatment, I quietly slipped out of the ICU and made my way to the staff locker room, needing a moment alone to process everything that had just happened. I sat down on the bench in front of my locker and put my head in my hands, the adrenaline that had been keeping me going finally draining away and leaving me exhausted and emotionally raw. I had just risked everything I had worked for to save the son of the woman who had tried to destroy me, and I wasn't sure whether that made me a hero or a fool. The door to the locker room opened, and I looked up to see Brittany standing there, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but shining with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. "They told me I could find you here," she said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Madison, what you just did, using that experimental treatment, Dr. Peterson told me you could lose your job for that. You could lose your license. Why would you take that risk for my son after everything I did to you?" I stood up slowly, meeting her gaze with a level stare that I hoped conveyed the complexity of what I was feeling. "Because that's not who I am," I said simply. "You tried to make me believe I was worthless, that I didn't belong, that I was less than human because I came from poverty. But you were wrong about me, Brittany. I'm not the person you tried to make me believe I was. I'm someone who saves lives, even when it costs me, even when the person I'm saving is connected to someone who hurt me. That's what you never understood about me, that my value didn't come from money or status or your approval. It came from who I chose to be." Brittany sank down onto the bench, fresh tears streaming down her face, and when she spoke, her voice was broken with emotion. "I don't deserve your mercy," she said. "I don't deserve to have my son alive because of you. But I'm so grateful, more grateful than I can ever express, and I swear to you, Madison, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did. Not just to you, but to everyone I ever hurt with my cruelty and arrogance. My son gets to live because you're a better person than I ever was, and I won't waste the gift you've given me." I sat down next to her on the bench, maintaining some distance but no longer feeling the need to keep an ocean between us. "Do you want to know what happened to me after nursing school?" I asked, and she nodded eagerly, clearly desperate to understand the journey I had taken. "I graduated at the top of my class, despite everything you put me through. I took a job at a county hospital in one of the worst neighborhoods in Detroit, working double shifts to pay off my student loans and sending money home to help my mom with my younger siblings." I paused, remembering those early years that had been so hard, but also so formative. I saw things in that hospital that would break most people: gun violence and drug, overdoses and children dying from preventable diseases because their families couldn't afford health care. But every patient I saved, every life I touched, it healed something in me that you had tried to break. I realized that my worth wasn't defined by your cruelty or your judgment. It was defined by the difference I made in the world, and that realization set me free from the power you had over me. Brittany listened intently, and I could see understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's why you forgave me," she said slowly. "Not because I deserved it, or because I apologized, but because you had already moved past me years ago. I was still trapped in that high school mentality, still the cruel girl who needed to put others down to feel superior, but you had grown into someone I could never be. She laughed bitterly. Do you know what happened to me after school? I married a rich man my parents approved of, had Ethan, and thought I had everything figured out. But my husband left me 2 years ago for his secretary, took most of the money, and suddenly I was a single mother working retail to make ends meet. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, and I saw her recognize it too. I ended up in the same place I tried to keep you in, she continued, struggling to pay bills, working a job I'm overqualified for, worrying about how to give my son the life he deserves. And you know what the worst part is? I realized that being poor doesn't make you less than human. It just means you don't have money. All those things I said to you, all that cruelty, it was based on a lie I told myself to feel superior. I'm so ashamed of who I was, Madison. I'm so sorry. I reached out and did something that surprised both of us by taking her hand in mine. I forgive you, I said, and I meant it completely. Not because you've suffered or because you've apologized, but because holding on to anger was making me into someone I didn't want to be. You taught me something valuable, Brittany, even though you didn't mean to. You taught me that cruelty comes from weakness, not strength, and that the people who try hardest to make others feel small are usually the ones who feel smallest inside. We sat there for a long moment in silence, two women who had been enemies finding an unexpected peace in the aftermath of crisis. Finally, Brittany spoke again, her voice tentative. Is there any way I can help you with the hospital board? If they try to punish you for using that experimental treatment, I'll testify on your behalf. I'll tell them you saved my son's life twice in one night and that you're the best nurse they could possibly have. I smiled at her offer, touched by the gesture even though I knew it probably wouldn't make much difference to the administrators who would be reviewing my case. Thank you, I said genuinely. But I made my choice knowing the consequences, and I'll face whatever comes. Some things are more important than careers and licenses. Some things, like a child's life, are worth any risk. We stood up together, and Brittany impulsively pulled me into a hug that I returned after a moment's hesitation, feeling the strange healing power of forgiveness flowing between us. When we separated, she looked at me with an expression of determination I hadn't seen before. I meant what I said about changing, she told me firmly. I'm going back to school to finish my nursing degree. I dropped out after 2 years to get married, but watching you work tonight, seeing the difference you make, it reminded me that I once wanted to help people too, before I became the person who hurt people instead. I felt a surge of respect for her, recognizing the courage it took to admit your mistakes and choose a different path. That's good, I said encouragingly. The world needs more nurses, and if you're serious about it, I think you could be a good one. You've learned empathy the hard way, and that's something you can't teach from a textbook. She smiled through fresh tears, and I could see the gratitude and hope warring in her expression. Can I ask you something? She said. Why did you really save Ethan? I mean the real reason, not the professional answer. I thought about her question carefully before responding, wanting to be honest with both of us. Because when I looked at him lying there dying, I didn't see your son, I admitted. I saw every vulnerable person I've ever been, every time I felt powerless and afraid and desperate for someone to help me. And I realized that the only way to truly overcome what you did to me was to be the person I needed back then, the person with power who chose to use it to help rather than to hurt. Saving Ethan wasn't about you, Brittany. It was about saving that scared girl I used to be by proving that kindness and competence matter more than revenge. My words hung in the air between us, heavy with truth, and I saw Brittany absorb them with a nod of understanding. You're remarkable, she said simply. I wish I had seen that 15 years ago. I wish I had been your friend instead of your bully. We could have learned so much from each other. I shrugged, feeling lighter than I had in years. Maybe we still can, I said. Not as friends exactly, not yet, but as two people who understand each other better than we did before. Before either of us could say anything else, Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway looking urgent. "Madison, the hospital administrator wants to see you immediately," he said, his face grave. "Someone reported the use of unauthorized experimental treatment, and they're convening an emergency review board." My heart sank because I knew this was coming, but I had hoped for more time to prepare my defense. Brittany's hand tightened on my arm. "I'm coming with you," she insisted. "They need to hear what you did and why." We walked together down the long corridor to the administrative offices, and I felt like I was walking toward my own execution because I knew the board had the power to end my career with a single decision. The administrator, a severe woman named Mrs. Richardson, who had never particularly liked me, sat behind her desk with 3 other board members flanking her, their faces stern and unreadable. "Nurse Hayes," she began formally, "we've received a report that you administered an experimental, unapproved medication to a pediatric patient without proper authorization or informed consent. Is this true?" I stood up straight, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Yes, it's true," I said clearly. "The patient was dying from refractory anaphylaxis. All standard treatments had failed, and the experimental protocol was his only chance at survival. I made the decision to use it knowing full well it could cost me my position here, but I would make the same choice again because that child is alive today because of it." The board members exchanged glances, and I could see Mrs. Richardson's jaw tighten with disapproval. "You understand that we have protocols for a reason," she said coldly, "that experimental treatments require approval from the ethics committee, informed consent from family members, and proper documentation. You bypassed all of these safeguards and put this hospital at risk of a massive lawsuit. What do you have to say for yourself?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Brittany stepped forward before I could speak, her voice strong and clear despite her disheveled appearance. "I'm Ethan Collins' mother," she announced, "and I'm the family member you're talking about. Nurse Hayes saved my son's life, not once, but twice last night. When he came in with anaphylactic shock, she stabilized him professionally and efficiently. When he had a biphasic reaction that no one could have predicted, she used every resource available to her to save him, including that experimental treatment. I'm standing here with my son alive upstairs because of her quick thinking and her willingness to take a risk when everything else had failed." Mrs. Richardson looked unimpressed by Brittany's impassioned speech. "Mrs. Collins, we appreciate your gratitude, but the issue here is not whether the treatment worked. It's whether proper procedure was followed. Nurse Hayes endangered her patient, violated hospital policy, and exposed us to potential legal liability." Brittany's eyes flashed with anger. "The only thing she endangered was her own career to save my son's life. If you punish her for that, if you take away her license or fire her from this hospital, then you're telling every nurse on your staff that following rules is more important than saving lives." The room fell silent as Brittany's words echoed off the walls, and I saw several of the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats because she had articulated exactly what was wrong with their position. Dr. Peterson, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward to add his voice. "If I may," he said respectfully, "I was present during both emergency interventions, and I can testify that Nurse Hayes made medically sound decisions under extreme pressure. The experimental protocol she used has shown a 92% success rate in clinical trials, and without it, that child would have died. She's one of the best emergency nurses I've ever worked with, and losing her would be a massive blow to this hospital's trauma department." Mrs. Richardson looked around at her fellow board members, clearly not happy with the way this meeting was going, but I could see doubt creeping into their expressions as they weighed the optics of punishing a nurse for saving a child's life. We'll need to review all the documentation and medical records before making a final decision, she said stiffly. Nurse Hayes, you're suspended with pay pending the outcome of our investigation. We'll notify you of our decision within 2 weeks. I nodded, accepting the suspension because it was better than the immediate termination I had been expecting, and I walked out of the office with my head held high even though my career hung in the balance. Brittany followed me into the hallway, her face flushed with anger. That's ridiculous, she fumed. They should be giving you a medal, not suspending you. I'm going to call every news station in Detroit and tell them what happened here tonight. I'm going to make sure everyone knows that you saved my son, and the hospital is punishing you for it. I put a hand on her arm to calm her. Don't, I said gently. Let them do their review. If they decide to fire me, then you can go to the press, but let's give them a chance to do the right thing first. She looked like she wanted to argue, but finally nodded reluctantly. Okay, she agreed. But I meant what I said, Madison. If they try to destroy you over this, I'll fight for you the way you fought for Ethan. The 2 weeks of suspension were the longest of my life, filled with anxiety and second-guessing and moments of deep regret for risking everything I had built. But they were also strangely freeing because they gave me time to reflect on who I had become and what truly mattered to me. I spent hours walking through Detroit, visiting the old neighborhoods where I had grown up, reconnecting with family and friends I had neglected during my single-minded pursuit of career success. And I realized that even if I lost my nursing license, even if I could never work in a hospital again, I would still be the person who chose to save a life when it mattered most. On the 14th day, I received a call from Mrs. Richardson asking me to come to her office, and I drove to the hospital with my heart pounding, prepared for the worst but hoping for the best. When I walked into the administrative suite, I was surprised to find not just the review board, but also Dr. Peterson, several senior staff members, and Brittany, holding Ethan's hand as he stood beside her, looking healthy and completely recovered. Mrs. Richardson's expression was softer than I had ever seen it as she gestured for me to sit down. "Nurse Hayes," she began, and I braced myself for the blow. After careful review of the events of that night, including interviews with staff members, examination of the medical records, and consultation with our legal team, the board has decided not to pursue disciplinary action against you. I felt tears spring to my eyes as relief washed over me like a wave, but she held up a hand indicating she wasn't finished. However, she continued, we cannot simply ignore the breach of protocol that occurred, no matter how successful the outcome. Therefore, we're implementing a new rapid response system for experimental treatments that will allow senior nurses like yourself to access promising therapies in life-threatening situations with expedited approval from the on-call administrator and attending physician. You'll be heading up the committee that develops these new protocols, working with Dr. Chen, who created the treatment you used. Consider it a promotion with additional responsibilities. I sat there stunned, unable to process what I was hearing, because instead of being punished, I was being given more authority and recognition. Dr. Peterson was grinning from Y continue ear to ear, and Brittany had tears streaming down her face as Ethan suddenly broke free from her hand and ran over to throw his arms around me. "Thank you for saving me," he said in his sweet child's voice. "Mommy told me you're a hero." I hugged him back, feeling the solid reality of this life I had fought so hard to preserve. And I knew in that moment that everything I had been through, all the pain and struggle and sacrifice, had been worth it to arrive at this point. Mrs. Richardson stood and extended her hand to me in a formal gesture of respect. "Welcome back, Nurse Hayes," she said. "Detroit Mercy Hospital is fortunate to have you on staff." I shook her hand, my voice thick with emotion as I thanked her and the board for their decision. As the meeting broke up and people began filing out, Brittany approached me with an expression of pure joy mixed with gratitude that seemed to radiate from her entire being. "I have something to tell you," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "I've been accepted into the accelerated nursing program at Wayne State University. I start in the fall, And when I graduate, I want to work in pediatric emergency care like you. Ethan's experience, watching you save his life, it showed me what I want to do with the rest of my life. I want to be the kind of person who saves children instead of the person who tears others down. I felt pride swell in my chest, not just for my own vindication, but for her transformation, because it proved that people really could change and grow and become better versions of themselves. "That's wonderful," I said sincerely, "and if you need any help with your studies or clinical rotations, let me know. I'd be happy to mentor you." Brittany looked at me with wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe I was offering to help her after everything that had happened between us. "You would do that?" she asked. "After all the horrible things I did to you?" I smiled and put my hand on her shoulder. "That's what being the bigger person means, Brittany. It means choosing who you want to be regardless of how others have treated you. You're trying to become a better person, and I want to support that because the world needs more people who are willing to change." 3 months later, I stood in the new emergency response training center that had been built with grant money the hospital received after news of Ethan's miraculous recovery spread through the medical community. Dr. Chen's experimental treatment had been fast-tracked for approval based on the success of that night, and hospitals across the country were now implementing similar rapid response protocols for experimental therapies. I had been interviewed by medical journals, invited to speak at nursing conferences, and had become something of a local hero in Detroit, though I tried to deflect attention and focus on the work. Brittany had started her classes at Wayne State and was excelling, her past experience giving her a maturity and perspective that her younger classmates lacked. She brought Ethan to visit me at the hospital regularly, and I watched him grow and thrive, a living reminder that the choices we make in moments of crisis define who we truly are. Sometimes I would see him playing in the hospital courtyard and marvel at how close we had come to losing him, how a few seconds difference or a different decision could have resulted in tragedy instead of triumph. One evening after my shift, I found an envelope on my desk with my name written in elegant script. Inside was a handwritten letter from Brittany, and as I read her words, I felt the final pieces of healing falling into place. She wrote about her journey of transformation, how becoming a mother had started to change her, but how almost losing Ethan had completed the process, forcing her to confront the person she had been and consciously choose to become someone different. She wrote about the guilt she still carried for how she had treated me and others like me, but also about the hope she felt that she could spend the rest of her life making amends through service and kindness. The letter ended with a simple statement that brought tears to my eyes. "You showed me that true strength isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to lift others up. Thank you for being strong enough to save my son when you could have chosen revenge. Thank you for showing me who I could become instead of who I was. And thank you for proving that the human capacity for forgiveness and growth is more powerful than hate or cruelty could ever be. You didn't just save Ethan's life that night, Madison. You saved mine too." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my locker, a tangible reminder of how far we had both come and how much can change when people choose compassion over bitterness. As I walked out of the hospital into the warm Detroit evening, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who had been so hurt and broken by Brittany's cruelty, and I wished I could go back and tell her that everything would be okay, that she would survive and thrive and become someone strong enough to save the life of her tormentor's child without hesitation. But I couldn't go back. None of us can. So instead, I carried forward the lessons I had learned, that our worth is not determined by how others treat us, but by how we choose to respond. That the greatest victories are won not through revenge, but through rising above the desire for it, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is show mercy to those who deserve it least. The sword of justice, I had learned, cuts both ways, and the sharpest edge is the one that frees us from the chains of our own anger and pain. Years from now, when Brittany graduates and becomes a pediatric emergency nurse, she'll understand what I understood that night in the ICU when I held that experimental syringe in my hand. She'll understand that every patient represents a choice, a chance to be the person who helps rather than hurts, who saves rather than destroys. And maybe, if we're very lucky, she'll pass that understanding on to the next generation of nurses she trains, creating a ripple effect of compassion that extends far beyond the two of us and the night that changed everything. The miracle that happened in that emergency room wasn't just that Ethan survived, or that the experimental treatment worked, or even that I forgave Brittany for all the pain she had caused me. The real miracle was that two people who had been locked in a pattern of victim and bully, hurt and anger, managed to break free from that pattern and create something new, something better, something that proved that redemption is always possible if we're brave enough to choose it. As I drove home that evening, the city lights of Detroit twinkling like stars fallen to earth, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The past no longer had power over me. The future held promise instead of fear, and the present was exactly where I needed to be. I had won, not by destroying Brittany, but by refusing to let her destroy me, and that victory was sweeter than any revenge could ever have been. Because in the end, the sharpest sword of justice isn't wielded against our enemies. It's wielded against our own worst impulses, cutting away the desire for vengeance and leaving in its place the strength to be merciful. And that, I finally understood, was the difference between surviving and truly living, between being a victim of the past and being the author of your own future. The emergency room would be waiting for me tomorrow, full of new challenges and crises and lives hanging in the balance, and I would meet them all with the same commitment and compassion I had shown that fateful night. Because that's who I am, who I chose to become despite everything that tried to break me. And nothing, not Brittany's cruelty, not the hospital board's investigation, not any challenge the future might bring could ever take that away from me. 5 years had passed since that night in the emergency room, and Detroit had transformed in ways both small and profound, much like the people who lived within its boundaries. I stood in the main conference hall of Detroit Mercy Hospital, watching as over 300 nurses, doctors, and medical students filled the seats for the 5th Annual Emergency Response Summit, an event that had grown from a small local training session into a nationally recognized conference on innovative emergency care protocols. On the stage beside me stood Dr. Chen, whose experimental compound had now saved over 2,000 lives across the country and had earned him a nomination for a prestigious medical research award. Next to him was Dr. Peterson, who had been promoted to Chief of Emergency Medicine, and Mrs. Richardson, who had softened considerably over the years and had become one of my strongest advocates within the hospital administration. But the person I was most proud to introduce was standing nervously at the edge of the stage, smoothing down her brand new nursing scrubs and taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, "it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce our final speaker today, someone whose journey represents everything we've been discussing this weekend about second chances, personal transformation, and the power of choosing compassion over judgment. Please welcome Brittany Collins, pediatric emergency nurse and recent graduate of Wayne State University's Accelerated Nursing Program." The audience erupted in applause as Brittany walked to the podium, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges and looked out at the sea of faces watching her expectantly. She had asked me repeatedly over the past week if I was sure she should be speaking at such a prominent event, if people would want to hear her story, if she was ready for this level of exposure. Each time I had told her the same thing. Her story was exactly what people needed to hear, a reminder that none of us are defined by our worst moments if we're willing to do the hard work of becoming better. Thank you all for being here, Brittany began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. 5 years ago, I was a single mother working retail and barely making ends meet. My son Ethan had a severe allergic reaction, and I brought him to this hospital in the worst panic I had ever experienced. The nurse who saved his life that night was someone I had tormented relentlessly 15 years earlier in nursing school. I had mocked her poverty, humiliated her publicly, and made her educational experience a living nightmare. And yet, when my son was dying and I was begging for help, she didn't hesitate. She saved him not once but twice that night, risking her entire career to use an experimental treatment when all standard protocols had failed. The room was completely silent now, everyone leaning forward to hear what came next. Brittany glanced at me, and I gave her an encouraging nod. That nurse was Madison Hayes, she continued, gesturing toward me. And the reason I'm standing here today as a nurse myself is because she showed me what it truly means to be strong. I had thought strength was about having power over others, about being wealthy and popular and making others feel small so I could feel big. But Madison taught me that real strength is about using whatever power you have to help people, even people who have hurt you, even when it costs you something significant. She paused, her eyes glistening with tears, and I saw many people in the audience wiping their own eyes. I spent 4 years in nursing school learning anatomy and pharmacology and clinical procedures, but the most important lesson I learned came from watching Madison work that night. She taught me that our past mistakes don't have to define our future, that people can change if they're willing to face their failures honestly and do better. Today, I work in pediatric emergency care because I want every scared parent who comes through those doors with a sick child to receive the same compassion and expertise that Madison showed me and my son. The applause that followed was thunderous, and I felt my own eyes filling with tears as I watched Brittany accept the recognition with grace and humility. After her speech concluded, we stood together at the reception, greeting attendees and answering questions about the experimental treatment protocol that had now become standard practice in emergency rooms nationwide. A young nursing student approached us shyly, holding a notebook covered in handwritten notes. "Excuse me," she said, addressing both of us. "I just wanted to say that your story really inspired me. I'm a scholarship student, first-generation college, and sometimes I feel like I don't belong here because I don't come from money like some of my classmates. But hearing how you overcame that, Ms. Hayes, and how you learned to be better, Ms. Collins, it gives me hope that I can make it too." I smiled at her, seeing so much of my younger self in her uncertain eyes and determined expression. "You absolutely can make it," I told her firmly. "Don't let anyone convince you that you don't belong. Your background doesn't determine your worth or your ability to be an excellent nurse. What matters is your commitment to learning, your compassion for patients, and your willingness to stand up and do the right thing even when it's difficult." Brittany nodded in agreement and added, "And if you ever encounter someone who tries to make you feel less than because of your circumstances, remember that their cruelty says everything about them and nothing about you. Keep your focus on becoming the best nurse you can be and let your work speak for itself." The student thanked us profusely and hurried away, clutching her notebook like it contained precious secrets, and Brittany turned to me with a soft smile. "I hope I helped her," she said. "I hope she doesn't have to go through what you went through because people like the person I used to be have learned to be better." I put my arm around her shoulders in a gesture that would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. "You did help her," I assured her, "and you're helping countless others by being the nurse you've become. That's the beautiful thing about redemption, Brittany. It doesn't just change you, it ripples out and changes everyone you touch." Later that evening, after the conference had ended and most people had left, I found myself back in the emergency room where it had all happened, standing in the spot where Brittany had collapsed on her knees, begging me to save her son. The ICU had been renovated since then, equipped with state-of-the-art monitoring systems and a dedicated rapid response team for severe allergic reactions, improvements that had been implemented partly because of what happened that night. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Brittany approaching with Ethan, who was now 13 years old, tall and healthy and thriving. "Hey, Madison," Ethan said, giving me a hug that reminded me exactly why I had made the choices I made. "Mom told me this is where you saved my life. I wanted to see it." I ruffled his hair affectionately and gestured around the renovated space. "This is the place," I confirmed. "Though it looked quite different back then. You were very sick, but you fought hard, and we all fought hard for you." He looked around with the curiosity of a teenager, trying to imagine a moment he couldn't remember, a moment that had nevertheless defined the trajectory of so many lives. "I'm going to be a doctor," he announced with the confidence of youth, "an emergency medicine doctor like Dr. Peterson. I want to save people's lives like you and Mom do." Brittany's eyes met mine over his head, and I saw in them the pride and gratitude and wonder that this was our reality now, that the boy who had nearly died was planning a future in medicine, that the woman who had been my tormentor had become my colleague and something close to a friend. "That's a wonderful goal," I told Ethan. "The world needs good emergency doctors, people who can stay calm under pressure and make tough decisions when lives are on the line." As they prepared to leave, Brittany pulled me aside one more time. "I never stop being grateful," she said quietly. "Not just for Ethan's life, but for the chance you gave me to become someone I'm proud of. I know I can never fully make up for the pain I caused you, but I hope that the work I do every day, the lives I help save, the nursing students I mentor, I hope all of that counts for something in the balance." I took her hands in mine, these hands that had once pushed me down and now worked alongside mine to heal and help. "It counts for everything," I told her honestly. "Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about creating a future that's better than what came before. You've done that, Brittany. You've become the person you were always capable of being, and that's the best apology you could ever give me." She hugged me tightly, and I felt the last remaining fragments of old hurt and anger dissolve completely, leaving only respect and appreciation for the journey we had both traveled. After they left, I made my final rounds of the evening, checking on patients and conferring with the night shift staff about ongoing cases. In room 12, a young woman about my age from nursing school sat with her daughter, who had just recovered from a severe asthma attack. The woman looked exhausted and scared, wearing clothes that had seen better days and clutching a worn purse that spoke of financial struggles I knew all too well. I sat down beside her and spent 20 minutes explaining her daughter's care plan, making sure she understood the medication protocols and knew about the hospital's financial assistance programs that could help with the costs. As I stood to leave, she grabbed my hand and said, "Thank you for treating us like we matter. Some of the staff, they look at us different because we don't have good insurance. But you made me feel like my daughter deserves the same care as anyone else." I squeezed her hand gently and replied, "Your daughter deserves excellent care because she's a human being, not because of what insurance she has. Never let anyone make you feel otherwise." And in that moment, I understood that this was the ultimate victory over everything Brittany had tried to make me believe about myself, that I could now be for others what I had needed someone to be for me all those years ago. Walking out of the hospital that night, I paused at the memorial wall where the hospital honored staff members who had made significant contributions to patient care. My name was there, engraved on a plaque recognizing the development of the rapid response protocol for experimental treatments. But more meaningful to me was the small photograph tucked into the corner of the emergency room bulletin board, a picture someone had taken at last year's hospital picnic, showing me and Brittany laughing together while Ethan played in the background. It was proof that people could change, that forgiveness was possible, that the worst moments of our past didn't have to poison our future. The Detroit skyline glittered before me as I walked to my car, this city that had witnessed my struggles and my triumphs, my pain and my healing. Somewhere in this city was that nursing school where I had been tormented, those hallways where I had learned that I would have to be stronger than the cruelty directed at me if I wanted to survive. Those rooms no longer held power over me because I had transformed their lessons into strength rather than bitterness, had used the fire of that experience to forge myself into someone unbreakable. And somewhere in this same city, Brittany was tucking Ethan into bed, perhaps telling him again about the night he almost died and the nurse who saved him, teaching him through her own transformation that we all have the capacity to be better than our worst impulses. Tomorrow she would put on her scrubs and go save lives, working alongside people who had no idea about the person she used to be, only knowing the compassionate and skilled nurse she had become. The sort of justice, I had learned, doesn't always cut the way we expect it to. Sometimes it cuts away our desire for revenge and leaves in its place something far more powerful. The ability to break cycles of hurt, to choose mercy over vengeance, to become living proof that people can change and that forgiveness can heal wounds that seemed permanent. That night 5 years ago, I had held Ethan's life in my hands and chosen to save him despite everything his mother had done to me.